Welcome to Ask Psych Sessions with Marianne Lloyd, where we ask some of the best teachers we know questions from you, our audience. If you have a question or an idea for a conversation, please visit bit.ly/Ask Psych Sessions. That's bit.ly/Ask Psych Sessions. All one word, all lowercase. And here's our next question.
Thank you for joining us. My guest today is Dr. Sarah Brownell from Arizona State University. Thanks for being here, Sarah.
Great. Thanks for having me.
So, as usual, I like to have our guests tell the listeners kind of who they are. What sort of classes do you teach? What's your background? You are an exciting guest because you are not in a psychology department. So just tell us a little bit about yourself, please.
Sure. So I was trained as a biologist. So I was an undergraduate biology major, went on to graduate school in biology, specifically neuroscience, where I studied multiple sclerosis and stroke using mouse models and trying to find new therapeutics to treat both conditions. And then along the way, like many graduate students, I was a teaching assistant and I loved it. And I wanted to spend a lot of my time teaching. And as I was teaching, I kind of went through that typical transition that folks go through where you have no idea what you're doing. And then you start to get a little bit more confident. And then you're like, I'm the best instructor ever. And then you realize that actually you're not, and you have no idea what you're doing again. And I wanted to get more of an academic foundation to teaching. And so I actually wandered over to the School of Education, started taking education courses, realized and just kind of accidentally stumbled into the field of discipline-based education research, specifically biology education research, and then realized that that's what I really wanted to do. So I ended up finishing my PhD in neuroscience, but afterwards transitioned into becoming a discipline-based education researcher, conducting education research full-time on undergraduate biology classrooms. And now as a professor at Arizona State, I am situated in a giant biology department, so a School of Life Sciences. And so I teach biology courses. I teach an upper level physiology course, and I teach other courses to biology students, but I conduct education research, specifically biology education research.
Great. Thank you. And that is why I've asked you to come on here, because a few weeks ago, the Chronicle had a really good teaching for inclusivity workshop that I attended, and you were a guest on the panel, and you talked about some of your new research on disclosure and benefits in large classes. And I thought that that would be of super interest to our listeners. And I don't know about my other listeners, but I barely get through the psych teaching literature, let alone anything in biology about teaching. So could you tell us a little bit about the project, please?
Sure. So my research focus broadly is on how we can create more inclusive science learning environments. Over the past few years, I've gotten really interested in what we might call concealable stigmatized identities, identities that folks have that at first glance, you look at them, you don't necessarily know what their identity is, right? So visible identities that we tend to assume are gender, or sometimes we can discern people's race, ethnicity from just looking at them. But there's a ton of other identities that we hold that you'd have no idea, right? Whether this is first generation status, or growing up in a low income family, or being a member of the LGBTQ community, or being religious, et cetera, et cetera. There are ways in which you can signal to be members of these communities and have these identities, but there becomes that decision point of, do you want to conceal? Do you want to reveal? Who do you want to conceal and reveal to, et cetera? So when we start to think about representation in the classroom, right, we all realize that who the current faculty are is not necessarily representative of who our students are, right? And so we've talked a lot about the importance of having role models and potential mentors in the classroom. And most of that research has been done looking at gender and looking at race, ethnicity. But the focus of my research group is to start to look at some of these other identities. So specifically, we have a new line of research looking at LGBTQ identities and exploring the extent to which LGBTQ students have instructors who come out or not come out in front of the class. What are some of the reasons why LGBTQ instructors would choose to reveal or conceal their identity and what the actual impact is on students of an LGBTQ instructor revealing their identity in the classroom.
So important, right? So, so what are you finding about this?
Yeah, so all of this work originated when we interviewed some LGBTQ students in biology. Now, I do want to say, since probably the majority of your listeners are psychologists or in psychology departments, I think the situation is a little bit different in biology, and obviously it depends on where you put psychology. Sometimes psychology is put more in social science, sometimes it's put more in natural science, and there might even be splits within psychology, but generally, what we know to be true as far as LGBTQ identities is the natural sciences and STEM, however you want to define that, tends to be far less welcoming and inclusive than humanities and social sciences. So when we talk to LGBTQ undergraduates, they have had humanities instructors or social scientist instructors reveal their identity in the classroom fairly regularly. Identity is talked about in the classroom. It's mentioned. It's not this kind of secret thing that we pretend doesn't exist. In biology, and I would argue in other kind of natural sciences, physics, chemistry, geology, it tends to be a very different situation where we often assume that those disciplines are completely objective, that identity has no relevance. We, of course, know that that's not true, that the identities of the people doing the research matter, the identities of the individuals on research teams are going to dictate how they interpret data, the types of questions they ask, et cetera. But because of that assumption that natural science is more objective, identity is often just kind of forgotten. And when we talk about, what instructors tend to bring to the natural science classroom, they tend to not bring their identities in. So it's an environment where this doesn't seem to happen. So when we've interviewed LGBTQ students, a lot of them are like, I've never had an LGBTQ instructor in science, right? And they're like, I don't know if any instructors are, no one has come out. And we've asked them, well, what if an instructor did come out? Like, how would that make you feel? And a lot of them were like, oh my gosh, that would be like life-changing, right? To see someone in a position of authority that I could potentially be someday, being able to navigate their identity as someone who's LGBTQ, as well as a biologist, that would just be so cool. But what was super interesting to us and really depressing at the same time was a lot of these students were like, but I don't think that they should actually reveal their identity because I'm worried what will happen to them. Will they get low teaching evaluations? Will they get made fun of by students, right? Would they, and some students were like, I don't even know, maybe could they get fired for revealing that identity? And so they harbored a lot of fear about some of the negative ramifications of revealing their identity. And so when we did this study, we took a step back and said, well, if the person with the most authority at the front of the room, if these LGBTQ students are worried that that person is going to have all these negative consequences and they don't think that that person should reveal their identity, how do we expect these students to feel comfortable bringing their full selves to the classroom, right? And this becomes even more relevant right now because there's a real push to develop more active learning, student-centered classrooms where instead of students just sitting in the class, not looking around, not paying attention to people around them and just passively absorbing the information from the instructor, instead with these active learning classes, we're asking students to turn to each other. We're asking them to work in small groups. We're asking them to do group projects, right? And that means that they're paying way more attention to who students are. They're talking to each other more. And that often means to that expands into conversations about their weekend, conversations about their personal lives, which arguably is a really good thing. It's getting students to develop more friendships that could turn into study partnerships. But if those students don't feel comfortable bringing their full selves, then they are stuck in situations where they have to conceal their identity, they have to lie about it, they have to evade the question. And all of this came out in some of our initial studies. So all of this work was really informed by this initial group of students that we interviewed, where they were like, it would be amazing if an instructor came out. I don't think that they should. And a lot of these students were really uncomfortable revealing their own identity in the classroom. So then the next step was we actually went and interviewed a bunch of biology instructors to see, okay, is this actually true, right? Are they not revealing their identity? And when we actually did, the first step was we did a national survey, and we found that way more biology instructors are out to their colleagues or students in their research labs than students in their class. So if we look at who actually reveals it formally in the class, fewer instructors reveal that. And then we tried to dig into some of the reasons why. And some of the reasons were, I'm afraid of some of these negative consequences. But what came out of that was most prominent was a lot of them had just never thought about it. They just didn't quite think that it could benefit students. They weren't sure what those benefits might be. And there was a part of them that was like, I just feel like it's a little bit inappropriate to share, even though they realized that felt hypocritical, right? That they had a lot of other colleagues that were revealing their spouses, that, were revealing their significant others, that, people would reveal other parts about their personal lives. But there was this kind of implication that because LGBTQ identity has to do with sexual orientation, that there's some kind of negative stigma associated with that makes it intrinsically inappropriate. So that led us to say, well, what are the benefits to students? And we went and dug into the literature, and nothing had been published at all. So there were some studies that actually looked at kind of the negative impact or sometimes the neutral impact of instructors revealing their identity on teaching evaluations. But when we actually looked at what the impact was on students, no one had done that. So we decided to do that study. Just as an initial pilot, we had a single instructor reveal their identity at the very beginning of class in all of 30 seconds, because we basically said, kind of in the very beginning of the class, they did a PowerPoint slide that kind of described who they were, that they liked hiking, that they liked small dogs, that they were a proud member of the LGBTQ community. That was it. And that they like chips or something, right? And that was it. And then they didn't mention it the rest of the time. And then we ended up surveying students about eight weeks later to ask them, did you remember this happening? Do you think that this was appropriate? And what impact did that have on you? And what was really exciting is that it seemed to benefit. Students remembered it. And they probably remembered it, even though it was something that was really minor, because it's something that they don't tend to have instructors do. Most of them thought it was appropriate. So over 95% of students said, yeah, it's just totally appropriate. It's just part of their identity. They didn't make a big deal about it. Why should they hide that? And that was so encouraging, because that seemed to counteract those negative perceptions that both students and faculty had about it potentially being inappropriate to share. And then when we looked at the benefits, it seemed to positively impact them building a relationship with the instructor, their sense of belonging in the classroom, right? Kind of a lot of different outcomes that we looked at. And it seemed to have positive benefits specifically for LGBTQ students, which was part of our goal. But then there also seemed to be benefits for other student populations, women, and overall, the students seemed to indicate, regardless of LGBTQ identity, that it was a good thing, because it was the instructor basically becoming more personable to them, right? Now, what we don't know is if the instructor revealed other kind of personal aspects, could that also lead to some of the same benefits? But I think the important take home was it certainly didn't lead to some of the negative implications that we were worried about before. And it represented for the first time some concrete benefits that could result from simply revealing that an instructor is a member of the LGBTQ community.
I just want to put a dramatic pause in so we can sink in, right? That little bit, right? Wasn't the chips. I also like chips, but that it was that piece. So I'm going to ask a follow-up question, recognizing that you may not have an answer for this, since this is also new. So yes, I do think maybe your instinct's right that in psych we talk about this a little more, but I still think that some recent articles in our field about our deep-rooted racism and patriarchy, we probably have some work to do too. So what I'm wondering about is, for those of us that don't identify but do worry about our students in the class with those identities, is there anything we can be doing that is going to at least be helpful, if not an equivalent, right? It would feel performative for me to put up pictures of my favorite friends from that community. Like, well, here's my husband, but look, we have all of these. Look at my neighbors that I hang out with on the weekends. We have a pride flag out front, right? That does not feel like the right call. Is there anything in the data and what students said that might be helpful for, I like that idea of instructor revealing being personable, but did anyone say anything that might be helpful for someone that thinks, great, that's the kind of classroom I want when we ask them to think, pair, share, that they feel comfortable bringing their whole selves in? Have you run into anything about that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think an important question. And so I should clarify a couple things. One is I'm certainly not advocating for every LGBTQ instructor to reveal their identity. It's a very personal decision. We often erroneously say that, someone has to come out. Well, you come out every single day, right? You make that decision to come out multiple times to multiple people, right? And so, there's lots of factors that influence that. This work was really informed by that initial study that showed that a lot of the instructors seemed like they would be potentially willing to come out. They just hadn't thought about it and hadn't thought about the positive benefits. Now, obviously, that's only relevant to think about kind of behavioral change for folks who identify as members of the LGBTQ community. But there are a lot of things that other folks can do, right? So things that we advocate for is, on the very first day of class, can you talk about how you want to create an inclusive classroom space, right? And especially if you're going to be having students work with each other or do a lot of group work, talk about what it means to have respectful discourse, right? Talk about what it means to have an inclusive teaching philosophy, right? That you want everyone to feel like they can bring their full selves there, right? And I'm really explicit about this for LGBTQ students, for students whose first language is not English, for students who are religious, right? Like, so highlighting, I think, different identities can help different students feel seen, especially when we typically have conversations related to kind of diversity and inclusion. I think a lot of us just immediately go to gender and race ethnicity. And broadening that conversation out, I think, can help more people feel represented and more people feel like you as the instructor care about them regardless of their identity, right? I think that's a step. You could also put something explicitly in the syllabus, right? Depending on to what extent we think the students actually engage with their syllabi. But that at least is there and it makes it explicit. Because I think that, something that is really important is that, we might have conceptions of how we feel about these things, but if we don't make that visible to students, then students might assume that we don't feel that way, right? So I actually have a line of research looking at the experiences of religious students, specifically Christians, learning evolution and how we can make evolution classrooms more inclusive for them. And what we have actually found is that a lot of biology instructors, regardless of their views about religion or the perceived conflict between religion and evolution, they often just avoid the topic of religion in the evolution classroom because they're just uncomfortable. They don't know how to talk about it. They don't want to make people feel uncomfortable. But because often some of the loudest voices in the evolution community are atheists who basically purport that you have to reject any kind of faith system in order to accept evolution, which actually is not necessary. And I could talk about that on a different podcast, or, if we want to go down that as a tangent. But because religious students tend to hear that in the news and social media, et cetera, then if an instructor is silent, then that student often assumes that instructor ascribes to the kind of dominant viewpoint of the evolutionary biology community, right? Even though it's maybe not dominant in terms of the numbers, it's dominant in terms of the loudness of the voice. And so I think that the same thing would be true for these kind of issues with LGBTQ identities, right? If no one talks about it, then some of those students' fears might make it feel like that classroom is not inclusive. So I think being explicit about creating inclusive classroom spaces, being explicit about, which identities like we want to support, that generally we want to create an inclusive space regardless of their identities, I think could be a really important step. There are other things you can do. So I have colleagues who, very intentionally bring in representation in their classroom in terms of the scientists that they feature. So there's an initiative called Scientist Spotlights that basically tries to highlight that you can have lots of different identities and be a scientist. Like, it doesn't have to just be the stereotypical image of a scientist. And so, so you can bring in LGBTQ representation in that way. And I feel like that feels less performative and more genuine to just highlight, right, this is this person who's done this really cool study that we're going to talk about. Oh, and also this person is transgender, right? Or this person identifies as a member of 500 queer scientists or something like that, right? And to just make that visible. There are also, ways in which you can make this community more like visually apparent in slides, right? Whether it's, indications as far as, the way certain people dress or whatever. So there are more subtle ways that you can do that if you're less comfortable kind of saying things kind of bluntly in the class.
I think it's just a reminder that you have to think about it, right? Like that, because we all, like you said, like sort of move towards the narrative. I really like what you said about if you don't mention that you have a faith background, your students in a science classroom are going to assume you're an atheist, and maybe not very nice about it, right? Which I'm with you there. With some examples. So thank you. Those are really helpful, concrete examples for people to bring into their classrooms. I would like to ask you maybe one more question before we wrap things up, which is, first of all, just thank you for doing this really great in the classroom work. I think that this movement to thinking about people, not just content, is so critical for student success. So is there something else from that or from anything else that you would like to tell our listeners about? We're going to learn one more thing from you.
Yeah. So, I think I do want to highlight this initial study that I just talked about. It's just one instructor in one classroom, right? Looking at the impact. And so we've actually just recently gotten funding from the National Science Foundation to expand this to other instructors, right? To different geographic areas, because, I'm sure the listeners are probably thinking, well, what about my specific geographic context, or what about my specific institutional context, right? Depending on if it's a religiously affiliated institution, right? Or depending on kind of the demographics of other folks kind of in the department. And so we acknowledge that. And so we're certainly not saying we need to generalize from this one case. We're saying this is an initial bit of evidence, and we want to try to start to collect more evidence. And we're hopeful that, when we're done with this grant, hopefully a couple of years from now, we'll have a greater evidence base to help show what the positive impact could be on students. More generally, I think that I would love to see us start to focus just in general more on some of these concealable stigmatized identities, and thinking about really when we're teaching our classes, right? I think we often think about what we teach a ton, right? And I think we're starting to think about how we teach, right? And do we want to teach in more student-centered active learning ways? Do we want to do group work? Do we want to do a field trip? Do we want to do a project-based learning, right? Like that kind of thing. But I think very few of us think about who we're teaching to. And the example that we think is really compelling, is it compelling to us as instructors with specific backgrounds, or would it be compelling to kind of all of our students? And I think that implicit in that is we've got to figure out who our students are. And there's a lot of instructors who have complete misconceptions about who your students are, how much they're working, right? I think we typically think of the traditional college student. And I think in a lot of ways, that traditional college student doesn't exist anymore, right? That typical college student right now is commuting, right? Potentially has a family, potentially is taking some of their coursework online and in person, potentially has to pause their education at a certain point because something happened and then they're coming back, right? So I think helping instructors, so I think on both sides, both instructors revealing more about their identities and backgrounds and experiences, and also trying to get a better gauge on students' identities and backgrounds and perspectives becomes really important, I think, to maximize learning.
Hear, hear. Thank you. I like that, right? Okay, so what, how, and who. Okay, that's going to be when I make sure I'm going to write that at the top of my syllabi when I start to do some revisions for fall. So thank you so much for your time and your insights. I'll put a link to your article in our show notes. I've been talking today with Dr. Sarah Brownell from Arizona State University.
Great. Thanks for having me.